My brother bought my company for the price of a bad year, and he did it without me knowing, and then he drove out to my shop on a Thursday in a car that cost more than my house to tell me he was saving me. That's the word he used. Saving. He sat across the desk I built with my own hands, in the building I'd been in for 18 years, and he told me with real warmth, with what I believe was genuine feeling, that he had stepped in to save his big brother, and that it was time for me to let go and let somebody with a head for business take the wheel. And I want to tell you that the worst part, the part that took me a year to understand, is that I don't think Lane was lying. I think my brother drove out to take everything I had and genuinely believed he was doing me a kindness. Stay with me, because I sat there and I let him talk. I let him lay the whole thing out, the debt he'd bought, the leverage he had, the generous terms he was offering me to walk away clean, and I did not say one word, because I had already been to see a woman named Priya Anand 3 days before, and I already knew the thing that my brother, with all his degrees and all his money and all his certainty, had never once thought to check. He bought my debt. He thought that meant he bought my company. And it turns out those are two completely different things, and the difference between them was the only thing I had left, and it was worth everything. My name is Wes Holler and I run a commercial roofing company, or I did, and I want to tell you what that actually means before I tell you the rest, because my brother never understood it and it's the whole story. I put roofs on buildings. Big ones. Warehouses, schools, a hospital, the kind of flat commercial roofs nobody ever looks at and everybody needs, and I have been doing it for 35 years, since I was 17 and carrying bundles up a ladder for a man named Sal Farrow who taught me everything. And I have to tell you about Sal now, at the front, because Sal is the reason I still have my company, though he's been dead 20 years and never knew it. Sal Farrow was an old Italian roofer with hands like catcher's mitts and no patience for a single shortcut, and he used to say a thing to me over and over when I was a kid learning the trade, and I thought it was just an old man's grumbling, and it turned out to be the most important sentence anybody ever said to me. He'd say, "Wes, do it right when it doesn't matter, so it's already done right when it does." He meant the work, mostly he meant flashing a corner properly on some cheap job nobody would ever inspect, because the habit of doing it right is the only thing you can trust when the big job comes and everybody's watching. But he meant everything, really. He meant the paperwork too. When I set the company up, years later, Sal was gone, but I heard him and I did every single piece of it the right way, the slow way, the boring way, even the parts that didn't matter, even the parts nobody would ever check. I got the license in my own name and kept it there because that's the right way to do it. Not because I ever in a million years imagined my own brother would come to take the company by buying its debt. I did it right when it didn't matter. And 35 years later, when it mattered more than anything ever had, it was already done right and it saved everything, and that is Sal Farrow reaching up out of the ground to save a company he never saw, through a habit he beat into a 17-year-old on a cheap job in 1987. That's the thing about the right way. You never know which boring, correct thing you did for no reason is the one that's going to save your life. So you do all of them. That's the whole secret. There isn't a clever version. It is hard, hot, dangerous, unglamorous work. I have fallen. I have scars. I have buried 2 men who worked for me, one from a fall and one from a heart that gave out in the heat, and I carried their caskets and I have sat in their kitchens with their widows, and that is a thing my brother has never done in his life and never will, and I say that not to be bitter but because it matters to what happened. I know what a roof costs, not in dollars, in men. The one who fell was named Tomas. 19 years he worked for me, and he did not fall because he was careless. He fell because a piece of decking that a general contractor had certified as sound was not sound, and it gave under him, and there is nothing, no harness, no training, no 35 years of experience that saves a man when the thing he is standing on is a lie somebody else signed off on. And I want you to hold that, because it is going to matter that a piece of paper saying a thing is sound when it isn't can kill a man, and I have known that in my body since the day I carried Tomas, and my brother has known it in theory on a spreadsheet never. I paid for Tomas's kids. I never told anybody that, and I'm only telling you because it matters to what kind of man I am and therefore to the choice I made at the end. Both of them all the way through school. It nearly broke me twice to do it, and I did it anyway, and I never once counted it as a loss because a roof costs men, and when it costs you one, you pay what you owe his family for the rest of your life, and there is no invoice for it, and no one makes you, and it does not appear on any balance sheet anywhere. And it is the realest debt I have ever carried, and my brother, who understands every kind of debt that can be written down, has never carried one that couldn't. Let me tell you about Lane, and I am going to try to be fair, because if I only give you the villain you won't understand how this really happens. And it happens in families all over this country every single day. Lane is my younger brother by 6 years, And he was, from the very beginning, the bright one. I want to say that without any edge on it, because it's just true. Our father was a machinist and our mother cleaned offices at night, and there was never any money. And there were two boys, and one of them was good with his hands and one of them was good with his head, and I was the hands. Nobody ever said it out loud, but everybody knew it, and I made my peace with it early, or I thought I did. Lane got the grades. Lane got the scholarship. Lane went off to the good school and got the degree and then another degree, and he went into finance, into money, into the world where you make money out of money without ever making a single thing, and he was good at it, he was very good at it, and by the time he was 40, Lane Holler had more money than our whole family had made in 4 generations combined. And I was proud of him. That's the part people don't believe when I tell this story. But I need you to hear it, because it's true and it's the reason it hurt the way it did. I was proud of my little brother. I bragged about him. When he was on some panel or quoted in some article, I'd print it out and pin it up in the shop, and the guys would rib me about it. My brother, the big shot. I loved him. And I want to tell you the thing that I think actually started the distance, because it wasn't money, not at the beginning, it was something smaller, and I didn't understand it for years. When Lane was a boy, before the grades and the scholarship, before he was the bright one, he used to follow me. Everywhere. 6 years younger, he wanted to be wherever I was, and where I was, from the time I was 15, was on roofs. And I used to take him. Weekends, summers, I'd take my little brother up on a job with old Sal, and Lane would carry the small stuff and hand me tools, and Sal would let him think he was working, and Lane loved it. He loved being up there with the men. He loved being my brother in a place where being my brother meant something. And then somewhere around the time he was 12 or 13, he stopped wanting to come. And I told myself it was just growing up, boys change, he had school things. But I remember the specific day I understood it was more than that. There was a kid from his school, a doctor's son, and we drove past a job site once with this kid in the car, and I was up on a roof, and the kid said something to Lane, something like, "Isn't that your brother up there?" And it was nothing, it was an innocent thing, but I saw Lane's face in the side mirror, and I saw him decide, right then, at 13, that being the roofer's brother was a thing to be ashamed of. That up was where you were supposed to end up, and my up was a roof, and that wasn't the right kind of up. I never held it against him. He was 13. But I think that was the day my brother started climbing away from me, and he climbed for 30 years, degree by degree, deal by deal, and I think somewhere in his mind the whole time, the thing he was climbing away from was a boy who was proud to hand his brother a tool on a roof, and by the end, by the Thursday in my office, he had climbed so far away from that boy that he could sit across from me and price me, and the terrible thing, the thing I understood at the grave, is that he had to. He had to make me a number. Because if I was still his brother, still the man who took him up on the roof and let him think he was working, then what he was doing was monstrous, and Lane could not be a monster in his own mind, so I could not be his brother. I had to be an asset, because you're allowed to acquire an asset, and that is how a good man's little brother becomes a man who forecloses on him and calls it a rescue. One tool at a time, one degree at a time, one small shame at a time, until the person is gone and only the position remains. There was 6 years and a whole world between us, and I loved him across all of it. And I would have told you 2 years ago that whatever else was true, Lane and I had that. We had blood, we had 2 kids from a cold house on the east side who'd made it, each in his own way, and that nothing could touch that. And that's the thing about a story like this. It's not the money that guts you. I want to be clear about that up front. If a bank had done to me exactly what my brother did, precisely the same maneuver, dollar for dollar, I'd have been angry, but I'd have understood it. A bank is a machine, a bank doesn't know your name. What guts you is that it was Lane. What guts you is sitting across the desk from the boy you taught to ride a bike, watching him explain patiently, like you're slow, why taking everything you have is the best thing that could happen to you. Let me tell you about the bad year, because you have to understand how the door got opened. For 18 years my company was solid. Not big, not fancy, but solid. 20, 25 men depending on the season, good contracts, a reputation. In commercial roofing, your reputation is everything because the work is invisible until it fails. And when a roof I put on doesn't leak for 20 years, nobody ever knows my name, and that is exactly the point. That is the whole job. You are buying 20 years of a thing not happening. And people who'd worked with me knew that about me, that a Holler roof didn't leak, and that got me the next job and the next for 18 years. And then I had a bad year. 2 bad years, really stacked. I'm not going to bore you with all of it because the details don't matter, and honestly some of it was my own fault, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. There was a big job that went wrong, not the roofing was perfect, but the general contractor above me went bankrupt in the middle of it, and I never got paid for work I'd already done and already paid my men and my suppliers for. 6 figures gone through no fault of mine, and there's no insurance for the guy above you going under. And that same stretch, material prices did a thing they'd never done, went up, and I had fixed price contracts signed before the increase, which meant I was bound to do jobs at prices that now lost me money on every single one. And I did them anyway because a contract is a contract and my name is my name, and every one of them bled me. So I did what you do. I went to the bank. And the bank had known me for 18 years, and they gave me a line, a real one, secured against the building and the equipment to get me through the rough patch, and that was the right call. That's what that money is for. You borrow against the good years to survive the bad ones, and then you pay it back when the work comes back. And the work was coming back. That's the part that kills me. I was through the worst of it. I had 2 big contracts signed for the coming year, good ones, profitable ones, enough to climb all the way back out, and I sat down with my numbers that winter and I could see the far side of it. I could see myself paying that line back down over about 3 years, and I was tired, but I was not scared. I had been in the trade 35 years, and I had seen bad years, and I knew the shape of climbing out of one. What I did not know, what nobody tells you, what I did not find out until it was done, is that a bank can sell your loan. Let me say that again because it is the hinge of this entire story, and most people have no idea it's even possible. When you owe a bank money, that debt is an asset. It's a thing they own, like a chair. And they can sell it. They can take the paper that says Wes Holler owes this money on these terms secured by this building, and they can sell that paper to somebody else, anybody else, and they do not need your permission, and in most cases they don't even have to tell you until it's done, and once they've sold it, that new person is now your lender. They stand exactly where the bank stood. Everything you owed the bank, you now owe them. Every right the bank had over you, they now have, and they did not lend you $1. They just bought the right to be owed. And here is what I understand now that I did not understand then. A loan like mine to a business having a hard year, secured by a building and equipment worth more than the loan, that is a very particular kind of asset. To the bank, it was just a loan they'd rather not carry through a rough patch. But to the right kind of buyer, a buyer who understands leverage, that loan is not a loan at all. It's a key. Because if you own the debt, and the debtor stumbles even slightly, even for a moment, you don't get repaid, you get the building. You get the equipment. You get everything the loan was secured against, at the price of the loan, which is pennies on what it's all actually worth. The debt is just the mechanism. What you're really buying, if you know what you're doing, is a legal path to take a whole company for the cost of a bad year, if you can just engineer the stumble. My brother knew what he was doing. I still don't know exactly how he found out my loan was for sale. I have theories. The banking world and the money world are the same world, they golf together, and a distressed loan on a small commercial roofer is exactly the kind of thing that gets mentioned at the right lunch, and my brother's whole profession is knowing about things like that before anybody else. Maybe he went looking. I've never known whether Lane came across it by accident and saw an opportunity, or whether he went hunting for a way into my business on purpose, and I have decided I don't want to know, because I don't think I could survive the second one, and I'm not sure it isn't true. However he found it, he bought it. Quietly. Through an entity, an LLC with a name that meant nothing, so that even when I eventually saw a piece of paper, my brother's name was nowhere on it. He bought my loan from the bank, and the first I heard of any of it was a letter, a cold form letter, informing me that my loan had been transferred and that all future payments should be directed to a servicer I'd never heard of. I remember reading it standing at my kitchen counter and thinking it was nothing, an administrative thing. Banks sell loans. I'd sign whatever and keep paying, and it wouldn't matter who I paid. I actually called the bank to ask about it, a woman I'd worked with for years, and she was quiet in a way I didn't understand at the time, and she said she was sorry, and I said, sorry for what? It's just a transfer, and she said again that she was sorry, and I hung up thinking she was being strange, and it was months before I understood that she knew who'd bought it, and she knew what it meant, and she was not allowed to tell me, and she was sitting there telling me the only thing she could, which was sorry. I've thought a lot about that woman, whose name was Denise, and about the position she was in because it's its own small lesson. She had known me 18 years. She had approved my line. She believed in me. She was rooting for me to climb out. And then her own bank, over her head, decided to sell my loan, probably to clean up their books. Probably nobody in that decision had ever met me. And Denise found out who bought it, and she understood immediately what was coming because she'd been in banking 30 years and she knew exactly what it means when a distressed loan on a healthy underlying asset gets bought by a leverage guy through a shell. She knew, and she could not tell me. There are rules, there are laws. She'd have lost her job and maybe worse. And so this good woman who had helped me for 18 years sat on the phone with me while I said cheerfully, "It's just a transfer, right?" And she could not warn me, and all she could do, the one thing she could do, was refuse to say, yes, it's just a transfer. And instead say, I'm sorry, twice, hoping I'd hear it. And I didn't hear it. That's the thing. She threw me the only rope she was allowed to throw, and I didn't catch it. I hung up thinking she was being odd. If Priya's letter hadn't scared me into acting a couple of months later, Denise's sorry would have been the only warning I ever got, and I'd have missed it completely. I went back and thanked her after, once it was all done, once I understood what she'd been doing on that call. And this woman got tears in her eyes, and she said, I sat at my desk after we hung up and I felt sick, Wes, because I could see the whole thing coming and I couldn't say a word. And I told her she had nothing to feel sick about, that she'd done the one decent thing the rules left her room to do, and that decency, even hobbled, even reduced to a single word she was allowed to say, had been real. Because that's the other thing I learned in all this. The machine is cold, the leverage is cold. But there are almost always people inside it who are not cold, who are trapped in it, who will hand you the one small warning they're permitted to hand you. A sorry, a quiet question, a pause on the phone, and your whole life can turn on whether you're listening closely enough to catch the decency that people are forced to smuggle to you inside the rules. I almost didn't go. That's the thing. I want anybody listening who is in a hard spot to hear this. I almost didn't take that letter to anybody because I was embarrassed, because going to a lawyer felt like admitting I was in trouble, and men like me don't like to admit we're in trouble. We'd rather climb out quiet and never let anybody see us struggle. And it costs money to sit down with a lawyer, and I was counting every dollar, and I very nearly told myself it was just a transfer letter and threw it in the drawer with the rest of the paper I didn't want to look at. If I had, I would have lost everything, and I would never even have known why. I'd have just woken up one day defaulted and foreclosed and gone, and spent the rest of my life thinking my brother was smarter than me, when the truth was I was holding the winning card the whole time and just never showed it to somebody who could read it. So I went. And Priya's office is nothing. It's a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax place. And she does not look like a savior. She looks like a tired woman with too many files. And I sat down across from her feeling like a fool for being there. And I put the letter down and I said, half apologizing, it's probably nothing. I just want to make sure I don't need to worry. And she didn't say it was nothing. She read every page, slow, and she got quieter as she went. And I remember thinking, oh no, thinking she was going to tell me it was worse than I feared, that I was already finished. And then she asked her question, who holds the license? And I answered it without understanding why it mattered. And I watched this tired woman in a strip mall office sit up a little straighter. And I watched her understand the whole thing about 4 minutes before I did. And she looked at me, and there was something almost like a smile at the very corner of it. Not a happy smile, a grim one, the smile of somebody who has just found the one loose brick in a wall that was about to fall on you. And she said, Wes, your brother doesn't understand what he bought. And I said, what do you mean? And she said it again, slower. Your brother spent a lot of money to buy a leash, and there's no dog on the other end of it. You're the dog, Wes, and you're not on the leash. You never were. Nobody put you on it. He bought a leash and a collar and an empty yard, and he thinks he bought you, and the only reason it's going to work out is that you walked in here instead of throwing that letter in a drawer. I have thought about you're the dog and you're not on the leash about 1,000 times. That is the whole thing. That is every person who ever got their life's work taken by somebody who bought a piece of paper. The paper is a leash, and it only works if you're actually attached to it. And most people are attached to it. That's the sad part. Most of the time the scheme works because the value really is in the building or the stock or the assets, and the leash is real. Mine only failed because 35 years ago I did the boring thing and got the license in my own name and kept it there. Not because I was clever, I wasn't being clever, I just did it the right way because Sal Farrow taught me to do things the right way, and 35 years later the right way, done for no reason at all, quietly saved my entire life. Let me tell you about the Thursday he came to the shop. It was a nice day. I remember that because it made the whole thing feel more unreal. The sun coming through the windows of my little office, the crew out on a job across town, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary Thursday, and my brother's expensive car pulling into the gravel lot where the trucks park. He came in and he shook my hand and he was warm, he was really warm, and we talked about our mother for a few minutes and about his kids, and I was glad to see him, I genuinely was, right up until he sat down across my desk and folded his hands and got the look. If you have ever been across a desk from a man who is about to do something to you and has decided to be gentle about it, you know the look. It is a terrible look. It is worse than anger. It is the look of a man who has already won and is now going to be kind to you about it. And he told me He told me he'd bought the loan. He said it like a gift. "I bought your note, Wes." Like he'd paid off my mortgage as a surprise. And before I could even understand what I was hearing, he was moving on. Fast. To the part he'd clearly rehearsed. About how he'd been watching me struggle for years. How it broke his heart. How he couldn't stand by and watch his big brother drown in a business that was. And he said that was always going to be a young man's game and a dying trade. He said the world was changing. He said roofing was getting consolidated, that the little independent guy like me couldn't survive, that the smart money was rolling these companies up into big regional operations, and that he was, in fact, doing exactly that, building a portfolio, and that my company, my building, my equipment, my contracts, my reputation would be a fine piece of it, and that the kindest thing, the smart thing, the brotherly thing, was for me to hand it over now on good terms and walk away with my dignity. And a consulting fee instead of getting crushed. And here is the maneuver, and I want to lay it out plainly because it is being done to people right now and most of them never see it coming. He held the debt. And the terms of that debt, the ones I'd signed with a bank that trusted me, had the ordinary teeth that all such loans have, covenants, they're called little conditions, and one of them was that if I missed a payment, or if my financials dipped below a certain line even for a quarter, the whole loan could be called, meaning the entire balance came due immediately, all at once, which of course I could not pay, nobody can, that's the point, and the instant I couldn't pay, he had the right to take everything the loan was secured against. The building, the equipment, all of it, for the balance of the loan, which was a fraction of what those things were worth. And he was going to make me stumble. He didn't say that part, but he didn't have to, I could see the whole board. He owned the note now, which meant he controlled the terms, which meant he could decline to work with me the way the bank would have. He could hold me to the letter of every covenant. He could refuse the small extensions and adjustments that a normal lender grants a good customer through a rough patch. He didn't have to do anything dramatic. He just had to be rigid where the bank would have been flexible, and I would trip because I was climbing out of a hole and the smallest push at the wrong moment sends you back down. And the moment I tripped, the note would be called and the company would be his legally, cleanly, with his hands staying perfectly clean because he wouldn't have taken anything. I would have defaulted, and default is my failure, not his theft. That's the beauty of it. He doesn't steal your company. He arranges the conditions under which you lose it, and then he's standing there to catch it, sadly, reluctantly, as a favor. And he offered me the exit. Sign it over now, voluntarily, and he'd be generous. He'd give me a soft landing, a title, some money, a way to save face. Fight him, and he'd call the note, and I'd lose it all anyway and be bankrupt on top of it. He laid those two roads out for me like a man doing me a favor by showing me there was really only one. And I want you to notice the specific cruelty of the structure, because it is the thing that made it so hard to fight, and it is being used on people constantly. He never once threatened me. Not once. A threat you can report, a threat you can record, a threat makes you the victim and him the aggressor, and Lane is far too smart for that. He never said, "I'm going to take your company." He said the opposite. He said he was worried about me. He said he wanted to help. He said he'd hate to see me lose everything in a default, and every word of it was framed as concern, as rescue, as a brother's love. But underneath the warm words the machine was already running because he held the note, and the note had the covenants, and the covenants would trip me on their own, by design, without him ever lifting a finger, and then he'd be standing there, sad-faced, catching what fell. He had built a thing that would destroy me automatically and then positioned himself as the friend trying to save me from it. And if I fought him, if I'd stood up and said, "You're stealing my company," I'd have looked paranoid. I'd have looked ungrateful. I'd have been the crazy brother attacking the generous one. Because on paper, on the record, in front of anybody, Lane had done nothing but offer to help. That's the modern version of it. They don't rob you anymore. That's crude. That leaves fingerprints. They arrange for you to fall and then extend a hand, and the hand is the robbery, and if you slap it away, you're the villain. I have thought many times that the old-fashioned thief who kicks in your door and takes your things is an honest man compared to this, because at least he lets you keep the truth of what happened to you. Lane wanted to take my company and also wanted me to thank him for it, and the horror is that he'd have gotten both if I hadn't walked into a strip mall and asked a tired woman to read my mail. That I want to tell you what I felt. Sitting there. It was not rage. I keep telling you that, and I need you to believe it because it's the truest thing in this story. What I felt was a kind of vast, cold loneliness, because I was looking at my brother's face, my little brother, and I was realizing that somewhere in all those years and all that distance, he had come to see me as a thing, not a person, an asset with a bad balance sheet, a roll-up target. He had done the math on me. He had sat in some office with a spreadsheet and modeled the acquisition of his own brother, and every number had worked, and not once, not one single time in that whole process, had the number stopped being a number and become me. That's what I was looking at across the desk. A man who loved me, I still believe that, who had also, in a completely separate part of himself, priced me. And I want to tell you the exact thing he said that told me the whole truth about how he saw me, because it was one sentence and it was worse than the foreclosure. He was in the middle of the gentle part, the letting go part, and he said, "Wes, there's no shame in it. Not everybody's built to run a business. You're a craftsman. That's a beautiful thing. Let somebody who's built for the other part handle the other part. You're a craftsman. Not everybody's built to run a business." I had run that business for 18 years. I had put 400 roofs on 400 buildings and not one of them had failed. I had made payroll through 2 recessions and a pandemic. I had employed 25 men and put their kids through school and buried 2 of them and paid for their families and kept every promise I ever signed my name to. And my brother, who had never made a single physical thing in his entire life, who had never once been responsible for another man's safety, who had never had to look a widow in the eye, sat across my desk and explained to me, gently, kindly, that I wasn't built to run a business. And here's the thing. He believed it. That's what I understood in that moment. It wasn't a tactic. In Lane's actual mind, running a business meant the thing he did, the money out of money thing, the spreadsheet thing, and the thing I did, the roofs and the men and the 18 years, that wasn't running a business, that was labor, that was craft, that was the beautiful, simple work of the simple, beautiful people, and somebody smart had to come along and do the real part. He had so completely confused the paperwork of a thing with the thing itself that he could look at a man who had done the hardest version of the actual work for 35 years and pity him for not understanding business. And that confusion, that exact confusion, is the thing that was about to cost him everything, because a man who thinks the spreadsheet is the company will always miss the place where the company actually lives. I didn't correct him. I just filed it away. Not everybody's built to run a business. And I thought, all right, Lane, let's find out which one of us understands this business. And I let him keep talking. Now here is what my brother did not know. 3 days before that Thursday, that letter about the transfer had finally made me nervous enough to do something I should have done years earlier, which was take all my paperwork to somebody smarter than me. Not a big firm. I couldn't afford a big firm and I wouldn't have trusted one. I took it to a woman named Priya Anand, who has a small practice in a strip mall 2 towns over, who does the boring legal work of small businesses, the licenses and the filings and the contracts, the stuff nobody thinks about, and who had done my paperwork years ago when I first set the company up properly. I took her the transfer letter and my loan documents and I said, "Priya, tell me if I need to worry about this." And Priya read it all slowly, the way she does, and then she asked me a question that nobody in this whole story had thought to ask, including me. She asked, "Wes, who holds the license?" And I said, "What do you mean the company's licensed, we're bonded, all of it?" And she said, "No, not the company, the qualifying party. In this state, a commercial roofing contractor at your level can't just be a company. A licensed individual has to stand behind it. A real human being with the qualifications and the exam and the record, who is personally responsible for the work. The company can only hold its contractor's license and its bonding because a qualified individual is attached to it as the responsible party. Who is that person?" And I said, "Well, it's me. It's always been me. I'm the one who sat the exams. I'm the one with 35 years and the clean record and the master's certification. It's me." And Priya Anand set down the papers and looked at me for a long moment and said, "Wes, your brother doesn't understand what he bought. Let me tell you what she meant, because it is the whole game, and it turns on a thing my brother, in all his brilliance, had never had to learn because he had never made anything in his life. My company's real value was not the building. It was not the trucks or the equipment or even the contracts. Those were worth something, sure. But the actual thing, the thing that made the company a company and not just a pile of ladders, was that it could legally do the work. It could hold commercial contracts, it could be bonded, it could pull permits, it could put a roof on a hospital, and it could do all of that for exactly one reason, because I, Wes Holler, was attached to it as the qualifying party. The license lived on the company, but it stood on me, my person, my certification, my exam history, my 35 years, my clean record. And that does not transfer with a building. It does not transfer with debt. It cannot be bought or foreclosed on or seized or rolled up, because it is not property. It is a professional standing that lives inside one human being, the same way a surgeon's license lives in the surgeon and not in the hospital. So here is what my brother had actually bought. He had bought a debt secured against a building and some equipment. Fine. He could, if he forced the default, take the building and the equipment. But the moment he did that, the moment he pushed me out, I would take the license with me because it was never the company's, it was mine. I just let the company stand on it. And a commercial roofing company that cannot legally do commercial roofing is not a company. It is an empty building full of ladders. The 2 big contracts I'd signed for the coming year, the ones that were going to climb me out, those contracts required a licensed, bonded contractor. The instant I was gone, the company couldn't perform them and they'd be void, and the clients would walk, and every other piece of work would freeze, and the bonding would collapse, because the bonds stood on me too. My brother thought he was buying a company for the price of a bad year. What he was actually buying, if he pushed me out, was an empty building, a pile of depreciating equipment, a portfolio of contracts that would evaporate the second his name touched them, and a loan he'd have to eat because you cannot squeeze repayment out of a corpse you created. He had leverage over the shell. He had no leverage at all over the only thing that made the shell worth anything, which was me walking around licensed in my own boots. He'd bought the cage. He thought he'd bought the bird. Now here is where the story gets hard, and where I have to be honest about the part I'm least proud of and most proud of at the same time, because I had a choice to make and it was a real one, because I could have destroyed him. Do you see it? I could have signed nothing, said nothing, let him call the note, let him foreclose, let him take his building full of ladders and triumph. Let him walk in on Monday as the proud new owner of a commercial roofing company. And then, the next morning, I could have walked into the licensing board and pulled my qualification, and watched from across the street as my brother stood in an empty building holding a worthless loan and a portfolio of dead contracts. Having spent real money, serious money, to buy something that turned to sand the instant he had it. I could have let him find out the way I found out, cold, blindsided, humiliated, out real cash, and it would have been justice, pure justice. He'd have done it entirely to himself, and I would not have lifted a finger except to leave. And I wanted to. I want to be honest. Sitting across that desk on Thursday, once I understood what I was holding, part of me wanted to just smile and say, okay, Lane, you win, where do I sign? And let him walk right off the cliff he'd built and land at the bottom and look up and finally understand that he'd been outsmarted by his roofer brother, the hands, the dumb one, the one who was good with a ladder and nothing else. If you have listened this far, let me stop and ask you what you would have done, because I have never been fully sure I chose right, and I mean that. When someone betrays you, and you discover you hold the power to let them destroy themselves completely, do you use it? Not by attacking them, that's the thing. I wouldn't even have had to attack him. I'd only have had to step back and let his own scheme collapse on his own head. And there is a real argument that he'd have earned every bit of it, that a man who prices his own brother deserves to find out exactly what happens when he underestimates him. Or do you warn him? Do you stop a man mid-mistake? A man who was in that very moment trying to take everything you have, and tell him the truth that saves him from himself, even though he'd never have done the same for you? Tell me in the comments, honestly, because I have gone back and forth on it for 2 years, and I'm still not certain the merciful thing wasn't also a kind of weakness. Let me tell you what I actually did and why, and then I'll let you judge. I told him. Not that Thursday. That Thursday I let him finish, and I told him I needed to think. And I watched the flicker of surprise on his face that I wasn't grateful, and I let him drive off in his expensive car thinking he had me. And then I sat in my shop until dark, alone, with the whole thing laid out in front of me, and I made my choice, and it was not for his sake. I want to tell you about that night in the shop, because it is the most honest I have ever been with myself, and I think it's the real center of this whole thing. More than the license, more than the grave, that I sat there with the lights off and I let myself imagine it. All the way. I let myself picture Monday, Lane walking in as the proud owner, calling a meeting, maybe even magnanimous about it, keeping some of the men, playing the benevolent new boss. And then I pictured Tuesday when his lawyers finally explained to him what he'd bought, and I pictured his face, and I want to tell you that I sat in the dark and I smiled. Felt good. I'm not going to lie to you and say vengeance felt bad. That's a lie people tell. It felt wonderful. For about an hour I sat there and drank the whole thing down, and it was the sweetest thing I'd ever tasted. My brother, humbled, ruined at his own game, finally understanding that the roofer was not the fool in the family. And then the hour passed. And in the quiet after it, I felt something I did not expect, which was that I felt like him. That's the thing. Sitting there savoring my brother's destruction, planning the timing of it, deciding how to let him walk furthest onto the ice before it broke. I was doing exactly the thing he had done to me. I was sitting in the dark with my brother laid out in front of me as a problem to be solved, a piece to be moved, and I was enjoying it, and I realized that the difference between me and Lane was not that he was capable of this and I wasn't. I was capable of it. I was doing it. The difference was only whether I would choose to keep doing it or stop, and that if I kept doing it, if I let him fall, then 20 years from now there would be no difference between us at all. We'd be two brothers who had each destroyed the other and called it justice, and our mother would have raised two men who priced their own blood, and I would have proven, finally and forever, that Lane was right about the family, that there was no floor, that it really was all just leverage all the way down. And I didn't want to be right about that. More than I wanted revenge, I did not want my brother to be right about what we were. I want to be clear about that. I did not warn my brother because I'm a saint. I warned him because of our mother, and because of a thing that happened when we were boys that I'll tell you about, and because I finally understood, sitting there in the dark, that if I let him fall the way he deserved to fall, I would be doing to him exactly what he had done to me. I would be treating my own brother as a thing to be maneuvered, an object in a plan, and I would win, and I would be, at the end of it, a man who had destroyed his own brother and called it justice, and that is a thing you cannot come back from, and I had watched what it did to Lane to become a man who could price his own family, and I was not going to become that man in order to punish him for being that man. So I called him and I asked him to meet me, not at the shop, at our mother's grave, which I know sounds like a dramatic thing to do and I didn't mean it that way. It was just the one piece of ground that belonged to neither of us and both of us. Let me tell you what I said to him there. He came. I half thought he wouldn't, that he'd send a lawyer or a text, but he came, and he stood there by our mother's stone in his good coat looking annoyed and wary, because I'd broken the script. I wasn't supposed to be calling meetings, I was supposed to be signing papers, and a man like Lane hates nothing more than a variable he didn't model. And I didn't gloat. I want you to know that because it was the hardest thing, standing there holding the winning card and not throwing it in his face. I just told him the truth, plainly, the way Priya had told me. I said, Lane, I need to explain to you what you actually bought, because I don't think anybody told you, and I don't want you to find out the hard way. And I laid it out. The license, the qualifying party, that it was me, personally, that it didn't transfer, that the second he pushed me out, the company he was foreclosing on would stop being able to legally do the only thing it did, that the contracts would die, that the bond would collapse, that he'd have spent real money to buy an empty building and a loan he'd never collect on. I laid the whole board out for him, every piece calmly, the way you'd explain a roof to a man who'd never been on one. And I watched my brother's face. I have thought about that face for 2 years, because I expected a lot of things. I expected him to argue, to not believe me, to think it was a bluff. And for about 30 seconds he did. I watched him look for the trick, look for the angle, because that's how his mind works, everything is an angle. And then I watched him do the math, and I watched the math come out, and I watched the exact moment my little brother understood that I was telling the truth, that he had spent a great deal of money and a great deal of quiet scheming to check and mate himself, that the roofer, the hands, the dumb one, had been holding the only card that mattered the entire time and hadn't even known it until 3 days ago. And here is the thing that broke my heart all over again. The thing I did not expect. He was not embarrassed about the money. He was a rich man, the money was real, but it was survivable. What crossed his face before he could stop it, in the second before the composure came back down, was something much worse, and it was directed at me, and it was contempt. For 1/2 of 1 second, my brother looked at me standing there having just saved him from a catastrophe. And what flickered across his face was not gratitude and not shame. It was the look of a man who has just realized he underestimated an opponent and hates the opponent for it. Even here, even now, even at our mother's grave, with me handing him his own life back, some part of Lane experienced it as a loss, as me winning a round, and it galled him. And that's when I finally understood my brother all the way down, and it is the saddest thing I know. Lane could not receive a kindness from me. He couldn't. Because in Lane's whole world, everything is a transaction and every transaction has a winner and a loser, and if I was being generous to him then that made me the one on top, the one with the power, the giver, and him the one below, the receiver, the saved, and he could not stand it. It was intolerable to him, more intolerable than losing the money would have been. My brother had built an entire life, an entire self, on being the one who'd risen above the family, above the trade, above his ladder-climbing brother, and I had just, by being decent to him, put myself above him in the one currency his money couldn't buy, and he hated it, and he hated me for it, for 1 naked second, right there. And then it passed, and the smooth came back down over his face, and he said something about how he'd have his people look into the licensing question. As if it were a technicality, as if I might be wrong, and I let him have that. I let him keep that little door because I understood now that he needed it, that he could not walk away from that grave having simply been rescued by me. He had to walk away thinking it was more complicated than that, that maybe he'd find an angle, that the game wasn't fully over. I let him have the door. It cost me nothing, and it let my brother keep his spine, and our mother was right there under both of us, and I was not going to be the one who broke him at her feet, even though I could have, even though he'd have broken me at mine. But before he left, there was one more thing, and I almost didn't tell you about it because I don't fully understand it, but it's true, so I'll tell it. As he was turning to go, I said, "Lane, do you remember the roofs?" And he stopped, and I said, "When you were little, you used to come up on the roofs with me and Sal. You remember that?" And my brother stood there in his good coat by our mother's stone. And for a second the smooth went off his face. Not the contempt this time, something else, something younger, and he said, "I remember the tar smell, and you'd let me carry the chalk line." And I said, "You were good up there. You weren't scared. Most kids are scared up high, and you never were." And Lane looked at me, and I watched him be, for about 2 seconds, a small boy who was proud to be up on a roof with his big brother, before he'd learned to be ashamed of it, before the doctor's son in the car, before all 30 years of climbing away, and then it closed, and he said, "That was a long time ago, Wes." And he got in his expensive car and drove off. But I saw it. For 2 seconds by our mother's grave I got my brother back, the actual one, the one from before, and I have decided that those 2 seconds are as much as I'm ever going to get, and I have decided they were worth not destroying him for. Let me tell you how it actually ended, because it did not end in a hug and it did not end in a war. It ended in a negotiation, which is the only language Lane speaks, so I let it be conducted in that language, and this is the part I'm actually proud of, prouder than if I'd destroyed him. Because I had all the leverage now. He knew it, once his own lawyers confirmed what Priya had told me, which took them about a week. The license was mine. Without me, his loan was secured against a corpse. I could have used that leverage to take him for everything, to demand he tear up the note, to humiliate him in the deal the way he tried to humiliate me. I had earned that. Nobody would have blamed me. I didn't. I made a clean deal, a fair one. Fairer to him than he deserved, and I knew it. I bought the note back from him. At a price that gave him his money back and not $1 more, no profit, no loss, exactly what he'd paid, so that he was made whole and so that I owed him nothing, not gratitude, not a favor, nothing, because I did not want to be tied to my brother by a debt in either direction ever again. And I want to be honest that fair is not the same as soft. Because people hear that I bought the note back at cost and they think I let him off and I didn't, and the distinction matters. I made him sell it back. He didn't want to at first. Once his lawyers confirmed the license was mine, he wanted to renegotiate, to find some angle, to salvage a profit or a stake or a foothold, and I said no. No stake. No foothold. No consulting arrangement. No, we'll keep it in the family. No ongoing anything. You are out, entirely, at cost, and you will sign a release, and you will never have a claim on this company again as long as you live. That was the deal, and I did not move off it 1 inch. So it was fair in that he lost nothing, but it was also total in that he got nothing, and the reason I could hold that line so hard was the same reason I didn't destroy him. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger negotiates. Anger wants to be bought off. I wasn't angry. I was finished, and a finished man is the hardest man in the world to move, because there's nothing left in him for you to trade against. My brother spent his whole career sitting across tables from angry people and eating them alive. He had never once sat across a table from a brother who simply had no more use for him, and he did not know what to do with it, and there was nothing to do with it, and that, in the end, was the whole of my revenge, and it was enough. I refinanced it properly with a real lender, on the strength of those 2 big contracts that were still perfectly good because I was still there, still licensed, still standing behind my own company. Priya handled the paperwork. Took about 2 months. And when it was done, I owned my company again, free of my brother, and I had lost nothing but a very bad year and a brother I'd apparently never really had. And I want to tell you one thing that happened during those 2 months, because it's the other half of the lesson and it's the part that actually still makes me tear up. My crew found out. Not the details, but enough. Small towns and small companies, word moves. They found out that somebody had tried to take the company out from under me, and that for a few weeks there it had looked like they might. And I did not ask them for anything. I want to be clear, I did not go to them. I was handling it quiet the way I handle everything. But my foreman, a man named Dutch who'd been with me 22 years, came into my office one afternoon in the middle of all of it, and he had a piece of paper, and it was signed by every single man on the crew, all of them, and it said, in Dutch's terrible handwriting, that if I lost the company and started a new one, all of them would walk out of the old one the same day and follow me to the new one for whatever I could pay, even nothing, even for a while, and that they'd already talked to their wives about it. Every man. Even nothing. Even for a while. They'd talked to their wives. And I sat there holding that piece of paper, and I understood the thing my brother would never understand in 100 years. The thing that was the actual answer to who holds the license underneath the legal answer. Because the legal answer was that I held the license. But the real answer, the true answer, the human answer, was that the company was never the building or the equipment or even the license. The company was 25 men who would follow me into an empty lot and start over with nothing rather than work for whoever bought the building. That was the company. That walked around on 2 legs and went home to 25 families every night. My brother thought he could buy that with a distressed loan. You cannot buy that. You cannot foreclose on that. That is built one man at a time over 22 years by showing up to their father's funerals and paying for their kids' school, and never once, not one single time, treating a man like a number, and it is worth more than every building I will ever own, and it is the one asset that appears on no spreadsheet anywhere, and it is the reason people like my brother lose to people like me every time they're dumb enough to actually pick the fight, instead of just buying companies from strangers who never earned that kind of loyalty in the first place. I kept that piece of paper. It's framed. It's the only thing on the wall of my office now. Not the articles about my brother the big shot. I took those down years ago. Just Dutch's terrible handwriting and 25 signatures. And I paid Priya Anand a bonus so large she tried to give some of it back, and I would not let her, and I told her that she had done in one afternoon with one question the single most valuable thing anyone had ever done for me, and that the question, who holds the license, was going to be the first question I asked every young contractor who ever came up under me for the rest of my life. Because that's the lesson she gave me, and I'll give it to you in a minute. Let me tell you where things stand with Lane, because people always want to know, and the honest answer is unsatisfying and true. We are not close. We were never going to be close again, and I've made my peace with that. We are, I would say, correct. We see each other at the holidays, for the sake of the family, for the sake of our mother's memory, and we are polite, and we do not speak of it, and there is a wall of glass between us now that will never come down, because you cannot unknow a thing like that. I cannot unknow that my brother priced me. I cannot unsee the spreadsheet with my life in it. And he cannot forgive me for the thing he can't even name, which is that I was kind to him when I held the knife, and that kindness sits between us worse than any injury could, because every time he looks at me he remembers the half-second of contempt on his own face at our mother's grave. And he knows I saw it, and he knows I know what he is, and a man like Lane can survive anyone knowing what he is except the brother he spent his whole life needing to look down on. There was one moment, though. One in 2 years, and I hold on to it, and I don't know what it means, and maybe it doesn't mean anything, but I'll tell you. Last Christmas at my sister-in-law's, in the crush of the family and the kids, Lane and I ended up alone in the kitchen for a minute, both of us getting away from the noise, and there was a long silence, the kind we have now, and then, without looking at me, looking out the window, Lane said quietly, "You didn't have to warn me. That's all. Not thank you." He can't say thank you. We established that thank you would put him below me, and he can't be below me. But "you didn't have to warn me" is the closest a man like Lane can come. It's the same thing routed around his pride. It's an acknowledgement that I'd held the knife and put it down, and I understood it. And I said the only thing I could think of that wouldn't cost him anything to receive. I said, "Mom wouldn't have wanted me to." And Lane was quiet for a second. And then he said, "I don't really remember her." And I understood, standing in that kitchen, that this was the truest and saddest thing my brother had ever said to me. Because he was 4 when the hungry winter happened, and he doesn't remember her giving away her portion in the dark. He doesn't have it. The thing that made me who I am, the memory that stopped my hand at the grave, Lane just doesn't have it. He climbed away too young. He never got the thing that would have told him what a family is for. And I've thought since then that maybe that's the whole story, not greed, not money, just that one brother got to keep the memory of a woman starving quietly for love, and the other one didn't, and everything else, the spreadsheets and the debt and the Thursday, All of it grew in the empty place where that memory should have been. I didn't say any of that. I just said, I know. That's why I had to be the one to remember for both of us. And Lane didn't answer, and then the kids came in, and the moment was over, and we have not spoken of it since. But he said, you didn't have to warn me. And I have decided that that is my brother's whole apology, and that it is enough because it is all he has, and a man can only give you what he has. I did not get my brother back. I want to be honest about that, because this is not a story where the wronged man wins and the family is restored and everyone weeps and embraces. I saved my company and I lost my brother, and I had already lost him. The losing happened years before the Thursday. The Thursday was just when I found out, and there was never a version of this where I got him back, because the brother I thought I had was a man who would never have bought my debt, and that man, it turned out, did not exist and maybe never had. What I got back was the truth and my company and my own self-respect, which I would have lost forever if I'd chosen to destroy him, and those are real things, and they are not nothing, and they are also not a brother. Now let me tell you the thing about our mother, because I promised I would, and it's the reason I did what I did. When I was 10 and Lane was 4, our father was between jobs, one of the bad stretches, and there was a winter where there genuinely was not enough, and I remember being hungry, actually hungry, and I remember my mother, who cleaned offices at night, coming home in the dark and cold, and there being this ritual where she would portion out what there was, and I figured out at 10 that she was not eating, that she was giving her portion to us and telling us she'd eaten at work, and she hadn't. There was no eating at work. She was going hungry so that 2 boys could have enough night after night all that winter, and never once said a word about it, never made us feel it, never used it, just quietly starved a little so we didn't have to. And I never forgot it, and Lane was too young to know it ever happened. And I stood at her grave 2 years ago with the power to destroy her younger son. And I thought about a woman who gave away her own portion in the dark and never mentioned it. And I understood that I came from that whatever Lane had become, I came from a woman who gave away what was hers to the people she loved and asked for nothing back, and that if I used my winning card to ruin my brother, I would be honoring my father's hunger and betraying my mother's answer to it. She had shown me, when I was 10, exactly what you do when you hold something and someone you love is going without. You give them your portion. You don't make them feel it. And you never, ever use it against them. That's why I told him. Not because he deserved it. Because she did. My name is Wes Holler, and here is the one thing I need you to carry out of this. And it's practical, and it might save your life's work someday, so write it down. Know what your company actually stands on. Not what it's worth. What it stands on. Because my brother made the single most common mistake there is among people who deal in money instead of things. He confused the assets with the source. He saw building, equipment, contracts, debt, and he thought that pile of stuff was the company. But the company didn't stand on that stuff. The company stood on a license that lived inside one human being, and that man had never once thought to ask where the real value lived, because in his world value lives in things you can buy, and it never occurred to him that the most valuable thing in my entire operation was a professional standing that couldn't be bought at any price, that lived in my person, that walked out the door with me when I left. Every real business has one of these. A license, a relationship, a certification, a key person, a thing that looks like a footnote and is actually the foundation, and it is almost never the thing on the balance sheet, and the people who come to take your company by buying its debt or its stock or its building are counting on you not knowing where it lives. Find yours. Today. Ask the question Priya asked me. If I walked out the door tomorrow, what could this company no longer legally do? That answer is your spine. Guard it, and no one can take your life's work for the price of a bad year, no matter who they are, no matter how many degrees they have, no matter whose name is on the loan. So let me leave you with the question I've carried for 2 years, and I want a real answer because I've never settled it. If you discovered that the person who betrayed you had, in doing it, set a trap for themselves that you alone could see, and you could simply step back and let them walk into it, and it would be justice, pure and clean and entirely their own doing, and no one would ever blame you for staying silent, would you warn them? Would you save the person who was in that very moment trying to destroy you, if saving them cost you nothing but your revenge? Because I did, and I'm still not sure it was strength and not weakness, and I lost my brother either way, and the only thing I know for certain is that I can look at myself and I could not have if I'd chosen the other road. He bought my debt. He thought that meant he bought me. And the one thing my brother never understood, the one thing all the money in the world can't teach you, is that some things live in a person and cannot be purchased, and the man who forgets that will spend a fortune buying a cage, and never once wonder where the bird actually lives.